Welcome to Shop Talk, everyone. I'm Brandy.
And I'm James, and we talk about all things related to cross-cultural workers and mental health.
Thanks for joining us, and welcome to Season 4. Hey, welcome back to Shop Talk. I'm glad you're here today. I'm super excited that we have my dear friend Bethany Walker here today. She's taught in public, private, and overseas international schools in her over 30 years of experience. She started her educational journey teaching high school Spanish and then taught in Title I elementary schools for over a decade before teaching and learning in an international school in Central Asia, living there with her family for 11 years. Bethany currently is the curriculum director of an online Christian school, North Star Academy, that has served cross-cultural servants around the globe for 26 years. Bethany joined the North Star leadership team after serving overseas. Bethany is passionate about listening to families and students to support their needs in education, whatever context they find themselves in, whether returning to their passport country, living overseas, homeschooling, or pursuing public or national school education. Bethany believes that each child and student is unique and that there is not one educational solution for all. We're going to talk about third culture kids and some of their unique education needs that they face and how we can better help them. So, might I add that I feel like I am the founding member and president of the Bethany Walker fan club. So, Bethany played such an integral role in both of our kids' early education. You either taught or trained their K-1 teachers and their preschool teachers in Central Asia. And my kids still love reading and writing. Our eldest just recently told me, I want to go back to grad school. I want to get back to writing. And they've both pointing to you as what you've done, as how you developed their love for this, helped develop that. And I think you were one of the reasons I survived my first 2 years in Central Asia. So your friendship, I mean, that and the grace and mercy of God, which I think was overflowing for you. So Bethany and I lived in Central Asia together for several years. Our kids are the same age now, so we're both parenting adult kids.
So, well,
Yes,
thank you for inviting me to be on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
So looking forward to it. As we were preparing to move to our house, if any of you are scratching off your bingo cards, yes, I just mentioned moving into our house. James could mention working on his PhD a little bit later, but we were going through some of our kids' old school things, and I ran across Max's old writings from K1, and the kid loved writing about ninjas, and he loved writing. He and his friend Daniel McCrindle, and there's always about weapons and fighting ninjas in some form, and so it was so cute.
That's a great place to start, I think, for TCKs and the conversation about education. I think when before I went overseas, I was a public school educator and a writer myself. And so I just really loved writing and teaching writing and seeing kids write. When we landed in Central Asia, I was asked at that time, I just had Andrew, and he was 21 months. So I wasn't really ready for school yet, but someone asked me, would you teach at the local international school for TCKs? And I said, I can do 1 day a week because I have a toddler. And so, but it's okay with me if you put first through sixth graders, and there were 3 language tracks at that time together, and I'd be happy to teach writing. And what I discovered at that time was what a powerful tool writing is for kids in transition. What I've discovered over time is a powerful tool for all of us in terms of dealing with our mental health and processing things. But that was a first step for me. So that was a powerful piece of my journey with, and still is with TCKs now.
I like how you said that that's such a powerful tool for helping them process what they're experiencing too, because a lot of times they don't have they obviously don't have the same words that we have to be able to process things, but they can process it where they are, and you would teach them to draw also and have a picture to go along with what they were talking about too. And so
that first class of kids, I think there were 12 kids in the class, and we had a really long block of time. They gave me 4 hours.
Oh my gosh.
And I loved it. So I would read to them and we'd talk about the books, and then they would write, and then they'd come and share, and they were grieving, heavily grieving. There had been, you have these patterns of time when you're serving overseas, and some in the community who've been there long leave. And there had been 3 or 4 significant long-term families who had left the field in May the previous year, just after we had arrived. In fact, one of my friends at that time had us at the going away party so that they wouldn't feel like they were in the rapture, because there were so many people leaving. And so when I started with these kids in August, they were grieving so heavily. And so all of their writing, all their poems, all their stories were about kids that they were missing. And so I started responding to that and reading to them stories about missing people we care about, the kinds of things, and just talking through that. And their stories and their poems were so powerful, and I think it really opened my eyes in a new way. Like I had seen that with my in my Title I school as well, that there's grief and transition, and I saw the connection between those types of needs in our education is being able to tell our story and being able to say, this is what I'm going through. And how do you put that into a piece that can be shared publicly, so that we can have corporate sharing and corporate grief, especially in a community where everyone's grieving at the same time for similar ways. And so bringing that connection so that there is an important piece to carry along on the journey together.
For TCKs in general, there's such a sense, and the younger they are, the less abstract thinkers they are, so they don't quite put themselves in everybody else's shoes. So they're not always aware that, oh yeah, everyone else I know is also grieving these same things. So having that kind of shared opportunity to process it together is kind of a way to bring and really normalize what their experience is, because otherwise they can only really view what their experience is. They don't know that even the other kids in the same class are also grieving unless there's a place to like process it and bring it up. And the more embodied ways you can do that, that's why writing is so good, is because we have to use our bodies. And kids, even little kids, act out a lot of this through play. And as they get into elementary school, they start, acting it out through what they're doing, through their assignments, the writing, the drawing, the talking, the theater, whatever kind of opportunities there are for processing. So that's awesome that you gave them kind of an opportunity and a voice.
Thank you. There was, I don't know, I think a lot of the programs for writing haven't always been good for in school programming, and also in our homeschooling programming, that giving prompts that don't really relate to students. I jumped out of the airplane and the parachute didn't open, so what happens next kind of prompt, where the kid has no experience for that. They're not able to share their own voice. And so when I was first in university, there was a lot of that kind of prompt giving, and it became part of our testing structure and things, and things have moved past that now. But sometimes it's still residual, these prompt things. But giving students choice and allowing them to share what's personal in their own life really has been super important, I think, to having students have the opportunity to really share who they are. And I think that's an important part of the education process. And what I'm discovering too is that, well, at each age level, so for preschoolers, what does that look like for a preschooler? And when we arrived in Central Asia, my son is a social learner, and so each kid is different, right? And what I've discovered every day of my life is that my two children are not the same. And I've noticed that in all the children I've taught, and some families with like 4 or 5, their educational choices had to be different for each kid because they were different, especially when you're living cross-culturally, because there's so many different variables in that.
Right.
But in the preschool, so there had been a woman there who had started a TCK preschool, and she was working with kids and she was working with some local women, and she was about to leave the country. She was one of those people that was leaving at that time, and she was going to shut it down. And I was like, oh no, I need this, And so one of the things that I used to call it a selfish, like out of my selfishness, I supported these local women in having the preschool because I needed it. And my dad said, I think you need to do a theology check on that. It's a personal passion, and not, that's your personal passion because you have a need. And when you have a need that benefits the community, then that's not selfishness. And so that was something I had to learn. Like being able to be in partnership and trying to figure out how do we educate our kids together became a really important part of my journey. And just saying that we are put into a corporate church situation, more of a big C than a little c, and that as the body of Christ, that that working together is an important aspect of being able to give TCKs what they need. And so when we can do something that doesn't just, whether it's a little co-op or if it's a social piece or a school or just sharing experiences and supporting one another, all of those pieces they make us better. And so just being able to use the gifts that we have alongside and discovering together what's the next step. And so looking ahead a little bit of what our children need. One of the things that was really at the beginning of our journey of deciding to go overseas, and what I realized when I went through some pre-field training, and then like, wow, yes, God has called me and my husband, but God has called our children too. It's not an accident that they're in our family, and it's not a surprise to God either. But also that decision in our obedience to God has a lifelong impact on them. And so once you take kids to another culture, they're there. Like that experience can never be undone, right? They are now a TCK. And with all of its joy and positives and all of its hard pieces. And my kids would not change it for the world, but it hasn't been an easy road. And I think our cultures across the globe are getting more and more where there's more TCK that's not the traditional, why you might have left a culture because a refugee experience is a TCK experience. There's so much more, I think, that would fit into that. I mean, like I did all the reading before I went overseas. I read the TCK book, and, I tried to be prepared, and there's nothing to really prepare you except to have people around you who can help you along the way. And I think that's important for our kids as well as for adults as we journey in that.
I think part of the challenge in not being able to prepare is that it's a constantly changing environment. The international schools, at least all the ones I've been connected to, I worked at one once a week for 5 years in Kenya. There's just so much change and transition. So you might have a really great teacher in a particular grade one year with a great group of kids, and all of those are different the next year.
Right.
You might have new teachers, new kids coming and going. And so the educational piece in particular is just really, really hard to predict. So I think families have to really be prepared to be flexible.
And to think about it early before
Yeah.
they're two, like don't wait till they need to be in first grade. Think about it when they need to be, when they're 3 or they're 2.
I was doing some research online yesterday, but knowing that we were going to talk about TCKs today, and I ran across something kind of interesting and sobering. I was talking about the adverse childhood experience scale, and I don't know if
ACE study,
right? Which, James, I don't know if you've read about. Oh, I know you know about the ACE study, but this particular article I read said that in the U.S., about 12% of kids experience adverse childhood experiences to the extent that that it's a high predictor. Is that what I'm saying? High predictor of future trauma or depression or joblessness and things like that. But for TCKs, it's 20%. And that was actually surprising to me, which doesn't mean, if you're a parent raising TCKs, it's not to raise an alarm bell that this is going to happen to your kids, because I think there are probably a lot of factors that go into it. It's like, where is your family? What are your family dynamics? And, just what chances do you have to communicate and process what's going on with your stuff? But or just a reminder that, like you said, Bethany, once they start the TCK journey, they don't really stop it.
Yeah, can't unwind it.
Yeah,
it's a lifelong journey. My brother, because my brother and sister and my parents lived in Kenya while I was in college, and so people ask me, "Are you a TCK?" And I'm like, "Sort of."
Yeah.
Because I was a kid left behind, right? And so, but my brother says he can tell within 5 minutes when he meets someone whether that person has a TCK experience. And I was just talking to my son recently. He started a new job, and he's a teacher, and he was working in a Title I school in San Antonio, and he connected with this other teacher, and they were working really close together. He was supporting a student in her class. And then later they they were having a conversation, several of them around, and he realized that the 3 teachers he had connected with had all were TCKs with
Wow.
different experiences, like DOD, or, like different experiences and reasons why they were TCKs, but they had that in common, and they had found each other as friends. And so I think that there's a lot of that. But one of the things with those kinds of statistics that we need to remember is that there's a lot that's a grouping of a lot of different situations put into one, but there's a lot we can do. There's a lot we can do to support and be ready and to walk our kids along their educational journey, but also the social pieces of that journey, and making sure that our kids have educational success. And educational supports and scaffolds and all of the things that they need in order to be able to re-enter well to whichever culture they end up back in, whether it's the parents' passport culture, whether it's another culture that they choose. And so we don't want to create additional barriers. And I think that's one of the things I learned really early on, is that whatever we need to do for kids to make sure that they don't have additional barriers, they already have some awkwardness of not, I mean, my kids came back to the States and they're like, what does it mean to be a United States citizen, and they really still don't always get that. So that is the piece that we educationally can help students be prepared as much as possible, whether that's because our student has a is special needs and has a particular learning difficulty, or whether that's because they're need advanced or type of honors type of push, whatever it is that our students need, if we can help to plan for that, then we're not adding an additional barrier to their transition whenever that is to happen. And then we can help with that 20%, because some of that 20% are people whose parents weren't thinking about it, who were in isolation, or maybe in a place where they didn't even have any social impact, or maybe the ministry or the work was more important. And so there's a million different reasons why it can go bad. And that's true in our home culture or our passport culture as well, but also just making sure that we understand there are things we can do to make it less traumatic.
Yeah, it's not like we're just sitting here wringing our hands saying, oh no, 20% of TCKs are going to, have a higher score on the ACE scale. But like you said, there are things that we can do to interact with them and interact well to help support them. I wonder if you can walk us through some things educationally that you see through different stages of maybe elementary education or middle school or high school, and just things that you see that might be unique for TCKs and ways that they can be supported in their educational needs.
Or things that might be common, but perhaps need to be addressed uniquely when it happens in a TCK.
Sure. Well, one of the things that's common, and I think this is probably common with homeschooling as well, is that any type of homeschooling, even if it's not cross-cultural, is that sometimes when we as parents are looking at our children, we see brilliance, and it may really be there. But then even with that, we want to push and advance students ahead in what we consider academically, but we forget the social part of that. And so, and those decisions that we make about pushing kids ahead, if we were in a school setting, they might be tempered by other individuals and adults around who would say, hey, maybe it's not so good to have your 10-year-old in a class with 12 and 13-year-olds and reading, especially the reading content. And one of the things that I watched, I had the advantage of having people who were a bit ahead of me and watching kind of those decisions being made. And I would suggest that to all parents is to try to have some folks who are a little bit ahead of you in the parenting journey that can speak into your life. But one of the things I noticed was that some of these parents who are pushing their kids to be ahead, I'm like, but do you really want them going to college when they're 16? Do you really want them reading this level of content in a book? And especially in language arts, it becomes an issue. This content in a book when they're 2 or 3 years younger than what that book was intended for. So what our kids are ready for when they're 15 to 18 years old, they're not really ready for when they're 12 to 14. And so pushing kids in that way. And so I made some decisions for my son who was quite solid in math. And I didn't want him to miss out on recess. And so in sixth grade, yeah, he was ready for pre-algebra, but we decided not to push him into pre-algebra because to go to what is the American title of middle school, but or 13 years old, was going to move us to a place where he was going to miss his recess in order to do math. And he's a bright child and a little socially awkward. Okay. And so at that time, especially, and so just knowing that about him. Okay. So if he really needs to have access to this math curriculum, is it something we can do over the summer so that it's not impacting his social piece, and making those decisions with other educators about what do you think is best, and being in a community for that. Because I did see a lot of folks that push their kids to a certain thing, to a certain curriculum, or pushing them ahead, and the consequences of that, especially with language arts. And that's one of the things I try to tell to parents when you're choosing books. It's not about what words they can read and how many of the words they can read. It's about being able to talk about the text. It's about thinking about the text and analyzing the text, and that you can go deeply into a book, and you don't have to go to that next content. But you want them to be ready for the content and have the age appropriateness of that.
I think there's some TCKs too that in many ways look more mature than their cousins or friends back in the home context. They may speak different languages, they know how to navigate air travel, and they have a passport. And there's many ways in which they are quite mature and have learned behaviors and things that are very different than their home context. But there's also actually significant ways that they are behind, like in emotional development, with all of that grief and the loss, and understanding who they are and their identity, that needs to be held in balance. It can't just be, pushing them ahead because of some areas are mature, but thinking of the whole kid when it comes to education and content. And I am often trained to encourage parents to have, especially those that are doing school at home, which was my background, to have like a class that's just about emotions and conflict resolution and some of these skills that we know TCKs need to work on, knowing what their home culture is like, to help just hold and balance all of that stuff.
When we first moved to Comdern, well, we'd been there about a year, and the middle school principal talked with me one day. She's like talking about her eldest, and she's like, in some ways she's so much more mature than the other kids here, and in some ways she's so much less mature. Because at that point in middle school, a lot of the kids came straight from the States. It wasn't so, they didn't have the boarding program then. So they were very used to their own American culture. It was like kind of American culture just imported there in Germany. And so in some ways, yeah, she was doing great. But then I just feel like she hit the nail on the head with that one, is like what you two were saying.
Looking at different ages, some of the unique challenges, I feel like that was really good, especially for that elementary age where you're trying to find that balance of where they fit in. And when you're going back and forth to perhaps thinking of Australia, who runs the school year from January to December versus the United States, and a lot of international schools are American or British system. So when parents are trying to hold all that, to not necessarily just pushing them ahead because in some areas they're competent, but really thinking about content and some of the other parts of educational development, like emotional readiness and intelligence and social skills and these other things. What about for that kind of middle school to high school? What are some of the things you see?
Sure. So yes, you're right about those who are in the Southern Hemisphere, like making that decision and thinking that through. Am I going to push my kid 6 months ahead or 6 months behind, or am I going to do something like a 6-month gap when we reevaluate? So thinking all of those things through. I know that with our German families going back to Germany because of the system that they would be going back to, one of the things that was articulated a lot was that the writing program that we did at our school in Central Asia was something very unique, and they were really pleased with that. But then the mental math piece that is not so in the American curriculum, and we were using some actually British curriculum at that time, was not the same as what you're going to be ready for when you go back. So really thinking through what are the consequences actually of the choices that you make now for being able to not have barriers for your kids when they go back. So if you're in a British education, there are very specific pieces that are different. And so looking at what kinds of curriculum you're going to use for those particular needs, what is your plan? And I know it feels like you're making a plan really far ahead, and you're not going to know exactly because your kids may make a different choice, but trying to keep as many pathways open for them and not close pathways with your decisions in their educational access. So if you think they might go back to Europe or the UK or the United States, then thinking through what do they need in order to not have to take extra classes when they get there, or not have to do an extra year, because that can be really discouraging and add to that anxiety and maybe some mental or social issues along with that. One of the things I'm also learning is that we as parents sometimes can add to the emotional strain and difficulty of each other.
No, that can't be
but
true. No.
No.
by not talking about things that are hard and realizing that our kids are going to go through things. And as a believer, as a follower of Jesus, it's we need to know that Jesus is the one that is responsible for their salvation, is responsible for, and that we have a part to play in that, but it's not all resting on our shoulders. And I think as kids transition into adulthood, as they finish their high school or secondary school experience, that and they move into maybe university, or maybe to a training school or some other program that they're going to make decisions about their life. Maybe they're going into work, that the decisions and the walking alongside them along the way is what we've been called to do, and then to continue to pray for them as adults and to support one another, because there can be some shame in the parenting part of that as our children go into adults, because they are going to struggle. Didn't we all struggle at some point in our life? And so if we think back to that, okay, so there's not a different standard in Jesus's eyes about what a cross-cultural worker will do than there is for everybody else. And it's about their individual relationship with him. And so I think that can put an extra pressure on us, which then makes us as parents, sometimes we say things that are not so helpful for our children in their decision making.
Surely that's not true. I've never done that.
And just a reminder for parents who may have accidentally said something they later regret is that repair is always possible.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Attachment can be repaired when disruption happens.
And our kids really appreciate it when we lean into that, and we lean into our own weaknesses. I mean, not lean into it, but we own up to what we've done.
And especially for those like 12, 13 and older, they need to be part of the decision. Like what are the kinds of things, like talking about that early, what are the kinds of things you are interested in and you think you might like to do? And can we explore that and get them into opportunities to try that out? My daughter said to me, I don't know, in the last year or so, she's like, how is an 18 or 19-year-old supposed to want to know what they want to do for the rest of their lives? And I think that's such a good question, because there was just, when I was in school, like I knew from when I was 3 or 4 years old that I wanted to be a teacher. So I just went on this track, and there was this track and I just went there, right? And things are just different now for kids. There's a lot more choices, a lot less loyalty to the job, and more openness to transition and moving. And our TCKs are going to be more comfortable with transition. And so taking, training, keeping the doors open so that you have options across the educational choices for students, whatever those are, and then listening to them. What is it that they love the most, and also making sure they get those basic requirements in that might be true of, making sure they have the basics. Because the worst thing in the world is to know you're going back to the United States and to skip taking US history, which is a requirement in every school in the US. Like what are the basic of where you're going to go that your students really have to have? And I remember working with students who were going back to Australia, and like they needed health. And so we as a school came up with, because that was a requirement in the US, it's kind of state by state, but where they were going back, they needed a health course. And so we worked to develop one, and we had someone who was a public health trained nurse who was able to teach it. So those things are just so important in thinking through what is it that will open the doors for students instead of closing them.
I think one of those challenges just gets intensified with where. I think a lot of our Korean families, the Koreans go to often English-speaking international schools, and then are not often able to go back to Korea to go to university because they've missed the really important testing process for admissions, or their Korean language isn't quite up to snuff, so they go to the US and sometimes can find their way there, but then after university they don't have a visa to stay there. So I know the same is true for some of our Germans who really have to work hard in addition to whatever educational system they're in internationally on their German skills, so they can go back and do either secondary school or university in German. And I think some of those educational pieces are just so much more complex. So to begin thinking about it early and helping develop good ties with your kids in those places of greater potential. A lot of our cross-cultural workers have met and married in another country, so then there's even more options. So beginning to develop good relationships and ties with those places, so that if that is where they'll potentially go back to, there's some good educational bridges already there.
And
Right.
Tracy and I were talking about the last podcast we recorded about the sandwich generation, and he's like, how many cultures did that one family represent? The Hanali, because she's
right.
Finnish. They lived in Ethiopia. Her husband's South African, Italian South African.
She's a
It's like-
TCK.
right. It's like,
Yeah.
wow, how much is going on here? And thinking about the education of their kids too. But I like what you said, Bethany, about giving your kids as much agency as they can, as you can in the decision-making process. I think helps build the bond with them too, and helps them build confidence in the direction, whatever direction they're starting to take steps in. I wonder, as you started this journey when your kids were really young, and now you're raising adult kids, or not raising them. You've got adult kids that you're still involved with. But I wonder if you've seen what changes you've seen in the whole TCK educational picture, or what trends you see emerging now, and just, some differences.
Right. So I do think, and I don't know, I don't think this is just TCKs, but I think that the teenagers that I work with now, working at a global school that touches a lot of different locations across the world, as well as homeschoolers in the United States and schools across the US and around the globe too, is that there is a lot of need for talking about identity and who they are in Christ, and having a place that's comfortable for students to talk, and to also be able to problem solve, to think critically, to learn those problem solving and critical thinking skills. And I know as parents, sometimes we want to protect, but my challenge is just to continue to remind parents that the best protection we can give to our kids is to give them the tools that they need to be successful when they're not with us. So we want our kids to have the hard conversations. We want our kids to have a place where they can ask questions, where they can even have doubts, where they can ask God hard things. And so those pieces are so important, I think, in that journey as well. Yes, I think mental illness and struggles with anxiety, especially. I'm seeing that so much more. In our context, we have a lot more students who have ADHD, which I think is because our platform makes it a lot easier. If you're online school and you can take regular breaks, and those kinds of things are a positive in dealing with ADHD. I don't know under the research whether there's just more cases of ADHD, or if that's something that's just being more observed, that wasn't or diagnosed and it was always there before. But I do think that those are pieces that are really coming out. It really is important to help kids learn how to have executive functioning, to be able to organize themselves and plan, and that we do that as they grow up in stages. Like, you wouldn't, of course, have a 5-year-old deciding whether they're going to take a bath or not, but like you train them over time, so that they have more and more, in educational terms we call it gradual release of responsibility. Maybe that's a psychology term as well, but like giving students a little bit over time, the training, and then releasing that. I remember as a child, my dad said the age of 13 was the year when he would really make my decisions were going to be my decisions, and they would give us advice, and they would give, and I'm sure there were some things where he would have said no, but but primarily he was saying, you're coming to that age of adulthood. And I don't know if it's from a Judeo Christian background, if he was choosing that because of the bar mitzvah for a Jewish family, but age at 13, but just really helping me to see, okay, from 13 on to 18, these are the these are the choices that we're going to give you advice about, but the ultimate decision is going to be yours. And just really helping students get to that place where they can make their own decisions and that they have a safety net to help them process through those, so that when they go to university or to the work or to training school, that they have had an opportunity to ask those questions in a safe place. And so I think that's one of the fixes for that, as well as just realizing that our kids are struggling with a lot of anxiety. That just seems to be, I'm seeing that more than anything else.
Absolutely. I love the fact that you're encouraging people to help, especially teens, exercise that decision muscle. Because so many TCKs, a lot of the decisions aren't in their control, right? A lot of times they can't work, they can't drive because of the visa issues or because of the laws of where they're living. So many of their life choices are being made by other people. So the more empowering opportunities you have, it's a muscle and it takes practice, and the better equipped they'll be to make good and healthy decisions in their own young adulthood and into life. And I think we also see a lot of increase in anxiety. We did a podcast on the increase of anxiety in adolescence. We also did one on trauma and TCKs, where we talked to Dr. Lindsay Stone, who did a research project on kind of ACEs and TCKs. So point people back to those episodes.
Bethany, as we're thinking about wrapping up, are there things that you wish that sending organizations or supporters, home churches knew about TCKs and their educational needs and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think that sending organizations can do a better job of talking about educational choices before they go on the field. Like once you arrive on the field, you are so overwhelmed with everything. Like my mother used to call cross-cultural, a definition for cross-cultural is feeling bad at everything you used to be competent at before. And so like everything's gone out of the window, right? Like I used to be able to cook. I used to be able to say hello. Yes. And so there's so much that's happening in that beginning time when you're in a cross-cultural situation, that having that conversation beforehand about what are the different options, and then also realizing that each child may be different. This child may do well in national school with some, other supplementation, or this child may do best in a social situation. This child really may need to be homeschooled, and looking at the options, and that one path doesn't have to be the same. So I think having those conversations before and just acknowledging that, and then pointing people to resources that they can access when they get to that place where they're not reeling from their transition, to really think about that. And then to encourage families to think about their education pieces, and that the education is an extremely important part of helping their children be healthy and have a long-term health, and be able to return to, if they choose to return to a passport culture. Educating students overseas in a cross-cultural situation is not public school. And so it has a cost to it. And so it means raising more support. It can have a financial impact, and being able to support that. And sometimes homeschooling might be the cheapest option, but it might not be the best option. And so being able to have the resources and to support a family in making that decision. If this child needs to go to an international school and the cost of that is more than a homeschooling curriculum might be, or if the parents need to have time for language learning, and homeschooling is a full-time job in the same way that teaching is a full-time job. And so really just thinking through those expectations that we have, and also the provision that we provide as churches. So having realistic expectations for a family that's transitioning to an overseas or cross-cultural situation, and also providing the resources that they need in order to be successful in that.
I've interacted with some families whenever I worked with teenagers, and the family, their experiences, like their sending organization was pretty inflexible as far as educational needs for the kids, and like, well, if you're here, you do this, and if this happens, you do this. And it's like, I would love to see churches and sending organizations trust the families more for the educational needs and decisions for their own kids too, because it's not one size fits all, nowhere near that, like you said earlier.
And I encourage organizations to have somebody who's checking up to see how families are doing. Because sometimes when you're in an isolated environment, you lose track of what is normal or what is at least, developmentally more common among other kids that age. I had somebody this past year who was here, a young man, and I asked the parents what their plans were for his speech issues, and they were like, "What speech issues?" Because it all just seemed so normal to them, but there was some clear a need for some actually significant work on his speech. So I think sometimes it's easy to get just lost in the life, and when there's not any kind of mirror to recognize how are we doing, it can be hard. So I think for organizations to have somebody checking in and asking those important educational questions so that it's not all on the parents and families to remember everything.
That would be the one piece I'd also say to sending organizations and maybe churches as well, is that families are going to have unique needs, and that may be testing or opportunities to go to conferences. I know the Share Education Conference was really helpful for us in getting my daughter tested for dyslexia. And so like those pieces of resourcing, you may not be able to go back to the passport country as often as you need to get all of those resources, but really just anticipating what that might be like and what the needs will be. And so just having that information, people don't always know what to ask.
Bethany, do you have any resources you'd recommend to our listeners?
Share Education has a lot, and I know that doesn't cover for all Asian parts of the world. There's also, is it ERIC? I think is the one for Southeast Asia, but really resourcing those organizations that can help you with testing, with conferences, with connecting about resources, I think is really important. And yeah, those would be my first steps. And also canvassing the community that you live in and seeing what people's skill sets are, because if you have a person who is a speech therapist or an occupational therapist, or they may not have time to do that all the time, but it is important to know who's resourced. And we do that for doctors pretty well in our communities, but not always for educational people. But test out your teachers. They went to school for a reason, and they know some things, and they might be able to answer some questions, but ask lots of questions.
Yeah, thanks, Bethany. This has been so good to talk with you.
Absolutely. I just so agree with everything you were talking about.
Well, thank you for this. I'll look forward to listening to more of your shop talks, but also let me know if it's going to publish. I'm on the member care team for our sending company that sent us, even though we're not being sent anymore. And so I was just having a conversation with our member care person. We have a team of people. So it's like 12 different people that have different resources that resource our partners, is what we call them on the field, because they're mostly in areas that are sensitive. So she was just asking me, so I was like, oh, maybe I could share this with her and she could share it, because that was the thing she asked. She's like, what would your dream be if you could do one thing for people before they go on the field? And I was like, I would really like to meet with each of them and just lay out the resources that are available, so that when they get stuck or they have a question, they know where to go. And so.
And again, if you want to join the Bethany Walker fan club, just please contact me, because I think you're wonderful.
It's mutual.
We have a lot of fun memories together. I was thinking about the time that it was snowy. I was driving to your house, and somehow I ended up driving our 4Runner, like it straddled this ditch or something, and I had to extract Max, like the car was leaning, and I had to lean in and grab him out. And then all those local guys and Sean were trying to get the 4Runner out of this precarious situation,
which they can do. It's amazing.
It's amazing. Remember Sean saying, okay, Brandy, you need to drive it this way now. I was like, I can't. And I was trying to get out of the situation, and Sean was just like, no, you can't.
You can.
And you're getting in the car now and you're driving.
Right.
I just love Sean was like, no, you're not getting out of this.
Well, Brandy was my brave friend who taught me that I could drive overseas. And so I did, because I saw you doing it, because women weren't driving very much then. So it was good. You were my brave friend. So
straddled ditches.
It was great to meet you, James.
Nice to meet you too.
Bethany.
Thanks so much.
Have a good day.
I'm gonna stop for a minute. Did you hear my dog and all that?
We have tens of listeners.
At least.